All right, peeps, we're live. We're live. Apologies for the delay. Honestly, super ridiculously tired. Ridiculously tired. And I was taking a quick nap because I was not going to be able to bring anything to this unless I took a nap. Sometimes, you just got to be honest with yourself about where you're at. Be honest with yourself about where you're at. And I know that there's no point in me going on here if I'm about to pass out during it. So let me just doing the usual, getting this stuff on Twitter. We're going to zoom through the wine. Nothing super special here today. Just a little comparison of Austria and Hungarian Gruner Veltliner. All right. Cool. So here's the wine. It's a short show today. Going to tackle some questions. I'm going to talk about timelines. And we're going to hit the rest of the stuff later this week because that's just what we got. I have a guest over here today, so I'm really just trying to squeeze it in because I couldn't get to it yesterday due to an emergency. All right. So Gruner Veltliner today. We have a very basic Gruner from Austria and a very basic Gruner from Hungary. Okay. I am expecting minimal to no difference between these two wines. All right. This one and this one. You look at them right now, they look the same. Not expecting much of a difference between these wines. Very basic. The reality is that when you get away from the Wachau and Kremstal and Kamtal in the Western Austrian wine region, which, by the way, I got two really incredible bottles of Wachau, a Gruner and a Riesling. So we're going to try them because if you guys recall from the last show, I really didn't feel happy about the selection that I had for the Gruners. Especially with Wachau, I think I neglected the best part of Austria. So taking care of that now. When you go to Eastern Austria, like the Weinviertel, which is really where the Danube turns south. So you hit Vienna and then it turns south. And that goes across and then it goes through Hungary. So this area is very similar to Western Hungary. And remember, I mentioned this before, but remember, this is the Austrian-Hungarian Empire before. So when we talk about Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, Hungary, obviously they're different countries. They have slightly different terrains, but where the wine production is, it all congregates around the Danube. The Danube is the main, because it has little slopes. It creates little slopes, and the Danube creates a cooling effect. So yeah, anyway, that's that. Let's try it out. Let's see what we got here. It's very, it's just so simple and so crisp. It actually almost tastes watery. And I say this in a good way. It's in a good way because just as a table wine, it's clearly Gruner, but it's got that little bit of how do I put it? It is just like a greenness to it. Oh, thank you. You guys are great. I appreciate you telling me that. Man. All right. So Tutor Turna just told me that I shared the wrong link. I shared a past Periscope link. Past show. So I'm going to share the correct link now so people on Twitter can get on here. All right, let's see here. Yep. All right, now we're rolling. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate that. All right. I was wondering why, a little bit of a lesser crowd at the moment. Although I am a little bit late, so there's always that. All right, so this was great. I want to check here. 13.5% alcohol, so that's more than I thought, to be honest. I was thinking it was going to be closer to 12.5. But now that I reflect, there is a bit of a burn. It's just very easy drinking. So this Hungarian Gruner, let's see this one. So it tastes to me more international in style. And what I mean by that is it tastes more like any generic white. So in terms of their quality, very similar, very similar. Um, the Hungarian Gruner has more heft to it, whereas the Austrian one, like I said, it seems it's less viscous. It seems like it just you're tackling more when you have the Hungarian Gruner. And by the way, I'm trying to ham this up a bit. They're both very simple wines. The Hungarian Gruner is not easily identifiable to me as a Gruner. I could have been convinced this was anything. Just a basic table white, similar alcohol percentage, yeah. It's 12%. So this is interesting. So I'm really like off with these percentages. Maybe the Austrian one really is just that much better made that the Hungarian one almost feels like a clunkier wine. Interesting. They give you a little sampling here in the back to show you all the stuff. All right, anyway, whatever, guys. When I have the Wachau wine next time from Austria, we're going to talk about that for a while because this is really, really cool stuff, and I think they're also biodynamic. But right now, we're going to talk about what I know most of you guys came here for, which is timeline shifts. Now, some of you guys saw my alternative show the other day, and I know a lot of people have been very interested in me talking about timelines, talking about timeline manipulation. What is it? How do you deal with timelines? So I'm going to give you guys first a little bit of a zoom out with this for a second. Jackson, it's great to see you. We're going to zoom out for a second. And by the way, for all the people who stumbled upon this, you're expecting just standard dating relationship stuff. Just one little friendly reminder. This is you're going to get all that stuff here, but I talk about advanced stuff. I talk about advanced topics. And the reason that I'm speaking about something like timelines, which might seem to you guys, you new listeners, you uninitiated listeners, may seem as if I'm talking about something very, very strange and totally not relevant. Well, that's not exactly true. If you want to play the game at a high level, you need to learn how to master time. You need to learn how to master your timeline, because what happens on the macro is that, and this is changing, but that forces, I guess you could say, have tried to redirect timelines, okay, and force us down pathways that we don't have control over. Now, I'm going to be speaking about this more on a micro level because you can learn to navigate timelines. And when you become very sensitive to this, you can actually start to see what I would call node points. Now, what is a node point? I'll give an example of a node point, okay? Really need to take a step back. And I know that if you want to get really technical, you could say that every moment's a node point. You could say that, but realistically speaking, there are node points. There are bigger node points and they're major and minor node points. And a major node point is that if you take something happens and that shifts you on a different direction, based on how you respond to it. Minor ones might change the course of your week or your day. Major ones will change the course of your next couple months and years. So you got to learn how to pay attention to this stuff and how to collapse it. This is super esoteric stuff. I know you guys love it, though. I know my diehards, you guys love this stuff. This is the reason that you listen to it. Because, hey, anybody can talk about getting laid, right? All right. So, the image of a cross. What is the significance of the cross? The significance of it is the vertical line which deals with time as we think of it. So future and past. And at the intersection of the cross is the present. That is where you are at this moment. Where you will be in the future is the vertical axis. Where you're in the past, the vertical axis. Remember, of course, on higher levels of consciousness and higher dimensions, there is no such thing as time. Okay? That is a lower density construct that we are living in, but we are changing out of. And perhaps some of you can recall situations where you felt time slow down, right? Or you felt time speed up. Wow, time really flew. Well, it's because time is a subjective experience that you are having here. All right? They call it a holographic reality when they call it the matrix. They can call it a computer simulation. Don't think of it like it's an AI controlled thing necessarily, although there has been AI hijacking of it. What we're talking about here is we're talking about the fact that this is a simulation because you're having an experience here and you're learning from it and you're growing from it and you're making choices that are going to take you on a positive or negative path. Okay. The horizontal axis is alternative. This is people get the vertical axis. Not too difficult for the vertical axis, right? The horizontal axis is alternative timelines of yourself that exist. Okay? And maybe some of you, less of you probably, but maybe some of you have had the experience where you feel like you're in a place but everything's different. Something's not right. It's possible, play around with this idea, it's possible that there was a timeline node shift and that your consciousness moved from a parallel timeline into a different timeline. And the reason that this stuff should be interesting to you, I mean, it's also interesting maybe in general, but it should be interesting to you right now because at this moment, there is a massive timeline battle going on in the macro. And so, whereas before things were relatively static, right? People were stuck in patterns and their life was kind of set for them. Remember that? Well, that was a control matrix. That was control of your timeline. That's been easing off of the decades, which is why you see more entrepreneurship. You see more people doing this or that. But you can be pulled within, you can, based on things that people do and choices you make, you can get pulled into what we call alternative realities. It's not fake realities. It's literally a separate timeline running parallel. If you were to do the things that they do at DARPA, yeah, this is real, by the way. But if you were to do the things that they did at DARPA, you would find yourself, if you were to try to get into a parallel reality, but just doing very, very brief things to change the reality, you would find maybe you would go to a situation, but someone would wear a different shirt. It would be that minor. But it can be much more substantial than that. Much more substantial. Why do you care about this? Is it just food for thought? Well, actually, the reason it matters is because when you understand that there's multiple different timelines that you can inhabit and that there are these certain node points, right? You can shift yourself into a timeline that's better. You understand? You're with your girlfriend. There's an issue going on. It's been going on for a while. There's a good chance you guys aren't going to make it, right? In one timeline, you don't make it. In another timeline, you do. Maybe you're not getting the significance of this. Maybe it seems like, well, okay, sure, I have a choice. So maybe I could. In one timeline, the two of you go separate ways. In one timeline, you guys have a happy relationship. So, what does that mean? That means that if you want to, remember, this is your choice. You get to decide what timeline to shift your consciousness into to experience. You can shift that dynamic into the one where it works. Now, she has a say in this, of course, as well. But the greater degree of your own mastery over this, the greater degree to which you can start to dictate the timeline. And also, even that last point, I mean, it's very complicated about people inhabiting different timelines at the same time. You see this right now. Go around and look outside and see how some people are wearing things and maybe other people aren't. People are inhabiting different timelines. They're inhabiting different realities. And because of all the different stuff going on, the warfare going on, they're in some ways inhabiting the same space. But if you believe and you manifest, timeline shifting connected to the magician archetype, well, I don't know exactly how to relate to that. The archetypes are all within us, and you can engage in this sort of, I suppose you could say, magic on your own. I would say I would suppose that the magician archetype would be more able to do this stuff. But this is a very powerful thing. So let's bring this to a practical. You want to change some habit. You want some outcome. Okay? Well, what's important for you to do is to feel into the timeline where that outcome has occurred. Feel into the timeline where that outcome has occurred. By the way, if it's very difficult for you to imagine an outcome, it's because that timeline has low coherence. This is an important point, and I'm glad I brought it up. Timeline coherence is very relevant. So when we say that, the light is winning and that they're going to win, right? There's no chance they're going to lose. What we're saying is that the ability to visualize a negative timeline where they really win, actually try to do that. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to do. There are timelines that have been envisioned that involved enormous amounts of difficulty with good winning. But you can't really imagine a timeline that they control everything, everything's done. If you try to do it, you'll immediately feel like a weakness in your muscles, which if you do anything with what's his face's David Hawking's muscle testing, there is no how do you put it? That's an indication that that's not an accurate statement. I can tell you personally, if I have to work at trying to see a negative timeline. Now, what can happen is that there are multiple possibilities at the moment, and I'm going macro to micro so you can bring it back to something that maybe makes sense that's going on in the world. If you go to macro right now, what you see is a lot of different potential sub-timelines. So, for instance, I can tell you right now, September 19th, just prior to the very significant equinox, expect things to kick off big time after the equinox. There are a couple of different timelines that have high coherence, high probability. And what that means is that these are timelines that if enough energy, they maybe hold varying percentages that are, above 20% of occurring. And what that means is that there's fights over where this is going to go. Some of these are very easy. There is a timeline that is in our grasp that is a very, very easy, smooth timeline, more or less. There will be the same economic issues, but it's going to happen relatively quickly without tons and tons of pain, and it collapses quickly. There's other ones that involve a lot of pain, in a lot of trials and a lot of tribulations. I can tell you personally, being connected to this, there's a timeline where things are very smooth and easy for me, and there's a timeline where I have to fight quite a bit. Either way, I win, but there are two timelines, and they both have coherence. Some timelines don't have strong coherence. So when it comes to you, if you're somebody whose life path is to have some sort of deep, serious relationship, you're going to have a family, there is, in theory, a timeline that exists of you being this massive player who just, buys Lamborghinis and stuff. But the reality is that the reality is that um, there isn't any how do I put this? There's not enough charge for that. So you trying to imagine yourself as it becomes different and that difficult, and that creates dissonance. So when we talk about conscious and unconscious connection and coherence and integration, a lot of what we're talking about here is we're talking about you aligning with the most coherent timeline for yourself. Now, when you have a couple of different options, you can move yourself more easily to the easiest of these. And over time, you move yourself to easier and easier timelines. When people talk about like manifest your reality, they're talking about this, but I'm trying to give it to you on a much deeper level, because this is that they're talking about, quantum physics, and they're talking about the fact that you can draw into reality certain things. But the reality is that there are already timelines that exist in a pre-matter form that already have coherence, and they're waiting to be manifested already. Those timelines are easier to pull yourself into. So, practically speaking here, what does this mean? What does it matter? When you have situations where it could go this way or it could go this way, or there's a couple different paths, you can feel into the version of yourself that exists in the timeline that has overcome the problem, that has gone the direction you want, and you can collapse the field, you collapse the timeline, and you pull yourself into that direction. I am not familiar with transurfing directly. I haven't read the book. I'm curious, based on what I've heard from others, if this is similar. But the point here is that when they say your reality is what you make it, it's totally true. Now, the last technical point I'll make, and I'll address some of these questions in the chat and comments, is that there is these nodes. You can try to collapse a timeline, but you have to understand that when we say it doesn't happen overnight, a current timeline line, and to bring us even more esoteric stuff to blow your minds maybe a little bit more, if you're even still keeping up with this stuff. Geometry is six-dimensional stuff, because when you get to pre-matter fabric, you're talking seventh dimension. Geometry is six-dimensional. It's fractals. It's antimatter beginning to take form. So that's why when we talk about these timeline things, we talk about them almost, they are like fractal patterns. They're lines with angles, and the angles are the nodes. Okay, so you will start to manifest a different timeline. You may have to wait days, weeks, months, even in some cases, before you hit a key node where you can shift onto the different track. Okay, so it's another reason about being patient, because if you're impatient, you expect a node to happen immediately, and you get frustrated. And then what happens is you lose coherence to manifest the timeline you want. This is what the idea of faith, belief, right? The power of belief. If you have faith, if you have belief, if you have hope, which is why I tell all you, fucking idiots, not you guys, but that you have to stay positive, because what you may be waiting on is a node. You might just be waiting on a node, and you hit the next node, and then you can change track. Okay, you get a bad diagnosis. Things are bad, they're bad. Well, you hit a node, something else comes in, new information comes in, and now you can jump onto a different timeline. One timeline you die, the next one you don't. By the way, side note, maybe you are supposed to die, and that's not a bad thing. because death isn't a big deal at the end of the day. But I want to make that point that you can choose to navigate this reality, but you have to believe in, and you have to lock on to certain outcomes, lock on to certain. And so to answer some of these questions, how can we distinguish between feeling into our preferred timeline as to falling into a fantasy? A fantasy comes from your mind, not your heart, and your mind is completely useless with this. And I appreciate the question, because what this does is it actually, this is actually very helpful for people, because if you, how do I put this? If you are, thinking doesn't have any quantum convergence, any quantum charge. So if you're trying to reason or think, or it's an anxiety response, like, I got to get this, I have to get this, I have to get this, your fear doesn't create a powerful, which is a fantasy fear. You're not creating a powerful charge. It's coming from your mind. It's not coming from your heart. And so you're not gonna be able to manifest anything. This is another big point when we talk about, you know, praying and getting what you want. Well, if you pray in a state of fear or in a state of greed, right, or sin, like, I want this, I want all this stuff, like, give me this, you know. And there are some religious people who do that. Well, good luck getting any of that stuff, because you're literally not speaking the language of the system. And you're also not providing the energy the system requires to move, right? You're not doing that. So when you know it, you feel it. And one of the big senses of debate right now is that a lot of people who are freaked out about where things are going, and they're freaked out about their lives and all these problems, is they're in a low consciousness state. It doesn't mean they're low consciousness altogether, but they're falling into pockets of lower consciousness, and it's depleting their quantum convergence charge, and very often they're getting into their head, which in scenarios that may have been programmed into them, yes, you do get scenarios programmed into your mind that are not in your best interest. How do you think the system was built? They need your energy. Why do they need your energy? Because your energy creates the system. You create your own trapping system. So if you believe for yourself there's going to be a war, there's going to be civil war, everyone's going to get, then you're part of a trapping system, because that's what they want. So ask yourself that question. People on a 3D, even 4D level will tell me that this is crazy stuff. You're not being realistic. Of course I'm being realistic. I understand where we are in the timeline. I also understand where the nodes go. And by the way, back in January, there was a big node that turned the other direction. To answer your comment, Toxic Rage, I remember being unable to visualize B as president back in winter. Is it possible timeline hadn't received enough energy yet? There was a massive, massive ritual, ask me how I know, in early January that changed that timeline. However, it wasn't just that changed the timeline. There was also, actually, in some ways, the opposite of that, because there was that timeline that was going to do was push us into a civil war, and then there was a different direction that was taken. Actually, in fact, I'm being vague for obvious reasons. That stuff isn't going to happen. They tried very, very hard to make that timeline happen. It didn't happen. But look, in your personal life, you can do this stuff. You can do this. You can, and this is when they talk about on these little things, like, believe and feel that you're a guy who's attractive to women. Well, there is a timeline, and believe it or not, it probably holds some pretty high coherence, where you are this attractive guy to women. And so, yeah, maybe you have to do this, but then you hit a node, a girl responds, maybe it's a mini node, a girl responds well to you, then you hit a different timeline thing, right? And you can move your entire trajectory in a different direction. People understand this on a lower level, but on a higher level, then they start to be like, oh, I don't really get it. But the thing is, if you understand it on a higher level, you can feel into it more. People don't understand what I talk about in the macro, because I feel into these nodes. I feel into these shifts. And when something shifts, I know it. I don't always know that's going to happen beforehand, For instance, I actually think things are better now than there was a high likelihood they would have been. But there was enough macro coherence for a positive outcome that we moved, and we move better and better. Hey, maybe we move back a little bit. This happens. You can feel it in the air. You can feel when people get upset and they freak out. You can feel maybe it drifts. You can feel that there's a push towards a more negative timeline. But you can change this. You can shift it. And most importantly, you can experience it for yourself. The last thing I'm going to say about this, because actually I'm only going to talk about timelines today. Sorry, the other questions, we'll address it early in the week, later this week, is that, and I don't want to get too impractical, but this is just for the people who want to experience hearing this information, because actually the act of experiencing hearing this information, even if you don't fully understand it, it activates your DNA, it activates your consciousness. So I'm going to say it anyway, even if you don't fully understand it. When we talk about the timeline split, it's because there are people who are living in an alternate timeline where things are very, very bad. These two timelines are so close together, people jump back and forth between them. Eventually, what's going to happen is that one timeline is going to lead to a golden age and things are going to be incredible. Another timeline is going to lead to like a hell, terrible situation. But here's the thing, you're not going to eventually see the people in that timeline because the timelines have moved too far apart from each other. You may still see people from that life who are in your life, but they're not going to hold strong coherence in your life because their consciousness exists in a different timeline. And this is where you have people who talk about the fact that, oh, well, there's people who exist here who aren't real. They don't have souls. It's not exactly true, but their souls are inhabiting different timelines, consciousnesses at that moment. So they're playing more of like a subpart. Okay? Pretty heavy, isn't it? Pretty heavy. Anyway. But yeah, Toxic Rage can confirm I took a big series of L's earlier this year, but then got an extreme amount of luck, which may have been the note I was waiting on. Luck is simply timeline manipulation and control. That's all it is. This is what they've done. They've tried to control your timeline, but now you can control your own. And yeah, there's the big stuff, but there's also the little stuff. The last thing I will say before I leave here, the last thing I will say, and this is important, is that when it comes to timelines, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I want to emphasize it, it has to come from what is an alignment. Because if you try to move into a timeline that isn't in alignment, you're not going to be able to generate strong charge towards it. Okay? Every single one of us has a very, very positive life path. That is a potential. But it's not going to be the same positive life path as somebody else. So, this is the danger of externalizing. If you go and think that you can tap into somebody else's timeline because you see what they're doing and you have lower consciousness feelings, you're not going to tap into anything. You're going to get controlled, or your timeline's going to be on autopilot. It's going to be influenced by other people's fields. So, get in touch with what you want and who you are, because that is the only real way that you can move to the best timeline. You can't do it if you look externally. I know I'm not going to be some billionaire or whatever. I'm going to be wealthy. I am, I'm fine right now, maybe, but depending on who you ask, I'm not going to be some sort of billionaire magnate, because that's not a timeline that holds high coherence. And if I'm being honest with myself, I don't really want that. For some people, there is a path where they're middling or they're super wealthy. There's all sorts of different timelines, but you have to make sure you tap into yours. All right. I love you guys. We will get back to it soon with show more talking about questions. I'll see you.